July the 1203, Constantinople. Not an enemy sword breaks the city first, it's a firestorm. Smoke rolls over the Golden Horn. Wind throws burning debris across rooftops. People aren't running from soldiers. They're running from a thing you can't parry, negotiate with, or intimidate. In this empire, fire is the weapon that doesn't stop when the fighting stops. This is why the Byzantines feared fire more than steel. Because steel takes lives, but fire takes everything. Everything. Your home, your food stores, your neighbor's house, then the entire block. The church where you prayed yesterday, the market where you bought bread this morning, the workshop where 3 generations of your family learned their trade. Gone. Not conquered. Erased. And here's the thing that's going to haunt you through this entire story. The Byzantines saw this coming. They knew. They'd been fighting fire for 900 years. They'd built systems, written protocols, organized response teams. They'd even weaponized flame itself, turned it into the most terrifying naval weapon the medieval world had ever seen. But in July 1203, as Constantinople burns, none of that matters. Because fire doesn't care about your preparations. Let me show you why this empire, the richest, most sophisticated, most strategically brilliant civilization left standing, spent centuries absolutely terrified of something that starts with a single spark. We're going back, way back, to understand how an empire learns to fear. Constantinople, the city built to catch. Here's what no one tells you about the Stone Empire. Yes, Constantinople had massive walls. Yes, it had marble palaces and soaring churches and monuments that made visiting foreigners weep at their magnificence. The Byzantines loved to project this image. We are eternal, we are stone, we are unbreakable. But step inside those walls. Walk through the actual neighborhoods where actual people lived. Timber everywhere, wooden balconies jutting over, streets so narrow that neighbors could reach across and touch hands. Wooden second stories added onto stone foundations because real estate inside the walls was worth its weight in gold. Wooden roofs, wooden market stalls, wooden workshops where blacksmiths and tanners and merchants stored flammable materials, because where else were they supposed to put them? The empire was built on a lie. The stone was just the skeleton. Everything else was kindling. And it gets worse. These neighborhoods weren't designed. They evolved over centuries, each generation building on top of what came before, adding extensions, filling every available gap, creating a maze of alleys and passages and dead ends where wind could funnel through like a bellows and flames could jump from roof to roof faster than a man could run. Constantinople wasn't just vulnerable to fire. It was engineered for it, by accident, by necessity, by the mathematics of fitting 1 million people inside walls that couldn't expand. One spark in the right place, with the right wind, at the right time, the entire city becomes a weapon against itself. And the Byzantines knew this. They'd watched it happen. Again, and again, and again. This wasn't theoretical. This wasn't some distant possibility they worried about in the abstract. Fire was a constant presence in the historical record. A recurring nightmare that showed up in imperial chronicles, in church records, in the collective memory of a civilization that never forgot what flame could do. Minor fires? Weekly. Serious fires? Every few years. Catastrophic conflagrations that consumed entire districts and left thousands homeless? More often than you want to believe. The Byzantine capital wasn't just a city. It was an ongoing fire management crisis that happened to have an empire attached to it. But here's where the story gets really dark. Because fire in Constantinople wasn't just a disaster. It was a political weapon. A way that chaos could amplify into something that threatened the entire system. Let me show you the moment the empire learned that lesson. January 13th, 532, when fire becomes apocalypse. The Nika riots. You've probably heard of them. sports fans, blues versus greens, the chariot racing factions, rioting in the streets. Emperor Justinian trapped in his palace, the empire on the edge of collapse. But here's what actually made it apocalyptic. The fire. The riots start as political violence, angry crowds, targeted attacks, the usual urban unrest that empires deal with through a combination of force and negotiation. Justinian's got options. He can make concessions, he can deploy troops, he can wait it out. Then someone sets the first building on fire, and everything changes. Because now it's not just rioters in the streets, it's a spreading catastrophe that doesn't care about politics or faction loyalty or who's winning the street fights. The flames jump to the basilica, then to the Senate House, then to residential areas that had nothing to do with the riots. Watch what happens to the city's psychology. People who were neutral, now they're refugees. People who were trying to stay out of it, now their homes are burning. The riot stops being about politics and becomes about survival. Panic spreads faster than the flames. Large parts of Constantinople burn, and Justinian, brilliant, ambitious, ruthless Justinian, nearly loses everything. Not to a military coup, not to a foreign invasion, to fire amplifying civil unrest into existential crisis. The empire learned something that day, something brutal and unforgettable. Your deadliest threat isn't always an invader at the gates. Sometimes it's your own capital, turning itself into an inferno, with you trapped inside. 30,000 people die before it's over. The heart of the city is reduced to ash and rubble. Justinian survives, rebuilds, goes on to reconquer half the old Roman Empire. But Constantinople remembers. They remember what fire can do when it gets loose in a densely packed city. They remember how fast order collapses when people are running from flames instead of fighting in formation. They remember that fire is the great equalizer. It doesn't care if you're rich or poor, loyal or rebel, soldier or civilian. It just burns. So what does an empire do when it realizes that fire is an existential threat? It fights back. Like fire is an enemy army, like it's a siege that never ends. Fighting fire like a war. The Byzantines organized. This wasn't some ad hoc bucket brigade system. This was imperial infrastructure, city authorities, designated response points, water access protocols, the kind of systematic approach you'd use to defend against a military invasion, because that's exactly what fire was, an invasion that could start from within. They mapped the water systems. Constantinople had something most medieval cities could only dream of: vast networks of cisterns, aqueducts, and storage facilities built up over centuries of Roman engineering. When a fire broke out, response teams knew exactly where to go, which reserves to tap, how to create fire breaks before the flames could jump streets. During sieges, when enemy armies cut off the water supply from outside, these internal reserves became the difference between surviving and burning. Think about what that means. Your capital needs an emergency response system comparable to its military defenses. Your city treats fire like an enemy that's always at the gates, always probing for weakness, always ready to strike when conditions are right. If that's your reality, you're not just afraid of fire, you're obsessed with it. But here's the twist that makes this story so perfectly Byzantine. While they were building all these defenses against fire, they were also turning fire into their greatest weapon. They were learning to control the uncontrollable, to weaponize the apocalypse. And it gave them a weapon so terrifying, so effective, so wrapped in secrecy and imperial power that enemies would rather flee than face it. Greek fire. The nightmare that burns on water. Imagine you're an Arab sailor in the year 678. Your fleet is the largest naval force ever assembled against Constantinople. Hundreds of ships, thousands of warriors. The Byzantine Empire is weak, fractured, losing territory across the east. This should be easy. You've got numbers. You've got momentum. You've got God on your side. You're sailing toward the walls of Constantinople, and you're thinking about the plunder, the glory, The moment when the great city finally falls. Then you see it. A Byzantine dromon, one of their fast, narrow warships, turning toward your position. You're not worried. You've got a dozen ships nearby. Naval combat is about ramming, boarding, hand-to-hand fighting. You know how this works. But the dromon doesn't try to ram you. Instead, it does something impossible. From the bow of the ship, there's a bronze tube, a siphon. And from that tube comes, what? Not arrows, not rocks from a catapult, something else. Something that makes no sense. A stream of liquid fire. It shoots across the water like a dragon's breath. 20 feet, 30. The stream arcs through the air and hits your ship's hull, and then your world becomes flame. This isn't normal fire. This isn't wood catching from a torch or oil burning in a lamp. This is something alive, something that clings to the hull like it's angry, something that spreads faster than you can react. Someone throws water on it. The fire intensifies. It burns hotter, spreads wider. The water doesn't put it out. It seems to make it worse, carrying flaming droplets across the deck, into the rowing compartments, onto the sails. Your ship is becoming a floating funeral pyre. And you can't escape it. Because here's the truly diabolical thing about Greek fire. It burns on water. Sailors jump overboard to save themselves from the flames, and the fire follows them into the sea. The surface of the water itself seems to burn. Men are swimming through liquid flame, screaming, dying in ways that shouldn't be possible. The ship next to yours tries to help, gets too close. The fire jumps. Now there are 2 ships burning, then 3, then the wind shifts, and burning debris starts raining down on ships 100 yards away. Your entire fleet is watching this happen, watching ships turn into torches, watching the water itself become a weapon, watching something that defies every natural law they understand about how fire works. And they break. Not because they're cowards, because they're human. Because evolution didn't prepare us to fight something that burns underwater and turns the ocean into hell. The Arab fleet retreats, the siege fails, Constantinople survives because of Greek fire. The secret that saved an empire. Here's what made Greek fire so devastating. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a mystery. The Byzantines treated the formula like a state secret on par with nuclear launch codes. Only a handful of people knew the composition. The knowledge was passed down through specific families, under imperial oversight, with the kind of security protocols usually reserved for protecting the emperor himself. Why? Because Greek fire was more than tactical advantage. It was strategic intimidation. As long as enemies didn't know how it worked, didn't know how to counter it, didn't know if they'd face it in the next battle, the psychological effect multiplied the physical damage. Rumors spread. Stories got more fantastic with each retelling. Some said it was made from dragon's blood. Others claimed it involved ancient alchemical secrets lost since the fall of Rome. Enemy commanders started factoring Greek fire into their planning even when the Byzantines didn't use it. That's the power of a weapon wrapped in mystery. But here's what we know. Greek fire was projected through siphons, bronze tubes mounted on ships, using some kind of pressurized system. Not just thrown like a regular incendiary. Projected, like a medieval flamethrower. That's the key difference. Any army can throw burning pots. The Byzantines could shoot a stream of fire 30 feet across water with enough force and heat to punch through ship hulls and turn naval formations into chaos. It gave them something impossible, a defensive weapon that could win naval battles against numerically superior forces. Constantinople's walls were formidable, sure. But walls don't protect your supply lines. Walls don't stop a fleet from blockading your harbor and starving you out. Greek fire did. It turned the waters around Constantinople into a kill zone where Byzantine numerical inferiority didn't matter, where one dromon with a siphon could devastate a dozen enemy ships, where fire became the equalizer. 707, 718. The sea turns into a trap. Let me show you Greek fire at its absolute peak. The moment when this weapon saved not just a city, but arguably the entire course of European history. The year is 717. Another massive Arab fleet is sailing for Constantinople. This isn't a raid. This is a full-scale invasion, the largest force yet. They're going to blockade the city, starve it out, wait for winter to break Byzantine morale, then storm the walls when resistance collapses. It's a good plan. It should work. The Arab ships establish their positions around the city. They settle in for a long siege. Supplies are good. Numbers are overwhelming. Time is on their side. The Byzantines wait. They let the Arab fleet get comfortable. Let them think this is going to be a conventional siege. Let them forget, maybe, what happened to previous fleets that got too close to those walls. Then the wind shifts. It's a small thing. A change in weather that any other day would mean nothing. But today, with hundreds of Arab ships anchored in relatively tight formations near the walls, with the currents of the Bosphorus pushing vessels just a little closer together, today, the wind shift is a death sentence. Byzantine dromons emerge from the harbor. They move fast. These ships are built for speed, not carrying capacity. They cut through the water like knives. And mounted on their bows, those bronze siphons catch the light. The Arab commanders see them coming. They start issuing orders. Prepare to repel boarders. Get the archers ready. Standard naval combat procedures. But the dromons don't close for boarding. They stop just outside arrow range. The siphons rotate. Aim, and then a roar, a sound like nothing else in medieval warfare. The pressurized stream of Greek fire shooting across the water, trailing black smoke, hitting the hull of an Arab ship with enough force that you can hear the impact even over the chaos of battle. The ship catches immediately, not slowly, not a gradual spread. The entire side of the hull erupts in flame that climbs the mast faster than men can react. Sailors are screaming. Some jump overboard. The fire follows them into the water, floating on the surface like an oil slick from hell. The wind, that treacherous wind, carries burning debris to the next ship. Now there are 2 ships on fire. The current pushes them into a third, 3 ships burning. The Byzantine dromons circle like sharks. Another blast of Greek fire. Another ship becomes a torch. The Arab fleet is packed too tight. Every burning vessel becomes a hazard to everything around it. Captains are trying to cut anchor lines, trying to get clear, but the wind and current are against them. It's not a battle. It's a cascading disaster. And the Byzantines just keep firing, ship after ship. The water between the vessels turns orange with reflected flame. Black smoke rolls across the entire formation. The psychological effect is worse than the physical damage. Crews on undamaged ships are watching their comrades burn alive in water, watching fire behave in ways that shouldn't be possible, watching their overwhelming numerical advantage turn into a liability. By the time it's over, the Arab fleet is shattered, not defeated in honest combat, destroyed by a weapon that turned their own tactics against them. The siege collapses. The invasion fails. Constantinople survives another generation because of Greek fire. Why this mattered more than winning a duel. Here's what you need to understand. A sword fight is local. One man versus another. Skill, strength, courage, individual factors determining individual outcomes. Greek fire was systemic. One burning ship could destroy half a dozen others through proximity alone. One successful strike could collapse the morale of an entire fleet. One weapon could erase months of logistics, years of naval construction, generations of strategic planning. In minutes, a traditional naval battle, you could lose and retreat and rebuild. Your ships might be damaged, but they're still ships. Your crews might be depleted, but they're still crews. You live to fight another day. Against Greek fire? If your ship caught, it was gone. Completely. And maybe you were gone with it, because jumping into water didn't save you when the water itself was burning. That's why Byzantine enemies feared it. That's why it became legendary. That's why the formula was guarded like the most precious secret in the empire. Greek fire gave the Byzantines something they desperately needed: the ability to punch above their weight, to turn defensive warfare into devastating counterstrikes, to make their enemies think twice, 3 times, a dozen times before committing to naval assault. It saved them, again and again and again. But here's the twist that makes this story so tragic, so darkly ironic. When you build your power around fire, when you master it, weaponize it, turn it into your greatest advantage, you start fearing it even more, because you know exactly what it can do. Here's the thing about mastering fire. You never really master it. You just learn how dangerous it is, how fast it moves, how little it takes to lose control. And when you've spent centuries weaponizing flame, when you've watched it save your empire again and again, when you've built your entire defensive strategy around the idea that fire is your weapon, that's when you understand the nightmare. Because fire doesn't care who controls it. The Byzantines knew this. They'd always known this. Every time they deployed Greek fire, every time they watched enemy ships burn, every time they celebrated another miraculous defense, they were also watching a preview of what could happen to them. And in 1203, that preview becomes a reality. Fire bypasses everything. Let me tell you what makes fire the perfect siege weapon, and I mean perfect in the most terrifying sense. Walls stop armies. Constantinople's walls were legendary, triple-layered, 40 feet high in places, towers every 50 yards, 1,000 years of engineering refinement. Armies looked at those walls and despaired. Fire doesn't care about walls, because fire doesn't attack the walls themselves. It attacks what the walls protect. It attacks homes, supply depots, morale, the psychological infrastructure that keeps a besieged city functioning. You can have the strongest fortifications in the world. Doesn't matter. Fire gets in through a single breach, through chaos, through accident, through someone's desperate attempt to create a firebreak that goes wrong. And then it's inside, with you, spreading through the very neighborhoods you're trying to defend. The Fourth Crusade understood this. Maybe not consciously, maybe not as deliberate strategy. But during the assaults on Constantinople in 1203 and 1204, fires broke out, multiple times, major blazes that consumed entire districts. And here's what those fires accomplished. They turned Constantinople against itself. Watch the cascade. A fire starts in a residential district. Families flee. Now you've got thousands of refugees flooding into other parts of the city, carrying panic with them. They need food, shelter. They're telling horror stories about walls of flame, about losing everything in minutes. The city's resources, already stretched by siege, now have to absorb this internal catastrophe. Defenders who should be on the walls are fighting fires instead, or protecting their own homes, or searching for missing family members. The discipline that keeps a siege defense working, it fractures, and the fires keep spreading. Because here's what the Byzantines had always feared. Once fire gets loose in Constantinople's dense neighborhoods, it becomes a chain reaction. One building ignites the next. Wind carries embers across streets. Narrow alleys funnel flames like chimneys. The city becomes its own weapon against itself. Historical accounts describe massive destruction, entire quarters burned, tens of thousands displaced, the social fabric of the greatest city in Christendom fraying under the heat, not because the walls fell, because fire bypassed the walls entirely. Thutasykes, terror of uncontrolled flame. Let me show you why this is the ultimate nightmare for any Byzantine commander. Soldiers? You can manage soldiers, pay them, discipline them, root them, cut them off from supply lines. Even in the chaos of siege warfare, Armies follow patterns. They have human limitations, human fears. Fire has no limitations. It doesn't get tired, doesn't need supply lines, can't be bribed or threatened or outmaneuvered, can't be stopped by brilliant tactics or desperate heroism. It just spreads. And in a city like Constantinople, with those narrow streets, those wooden additions to stone buildings, those centuries of accumulated debris, fire spreads like it's hunting. One spark in the right place with the right wind, the entire defense collapses into chaos. Imagine you're a Byzantine officer in 1203. Your job is to hold a section of wall against Crusader assault. You've got troops positioned, supplies ready. You know the enemy's tactics. You're prepared. Then someone runs up. The district behind us is on fire. What do? Hold your position while your family burns? While everything you own turns to ash? While smoke rolls over your defensive positions and your men start coughing, losing visibility, losing discipline? Or do you abandon your post and try to save something, anything, from the flames? There's no good answer. That's the horror of it. Fire turns every defender into someone making impossible choices. Stay and fight while your city burns behind you? Or try to save the city and leave the walls undefended? The Crusaders don't even have to make these choices for you. The fire does it. The fire fractures your defense by creating a disaster you can't ignore and can't solve and can't escape. That's why fire is worse than an army you can fight. Fire just wins. By existing, by spreading, by forcing you to choose between military necessity and human survival. The lesson Byzantium learned too well. So let's zoom out. Let's see the full picture of what Byzantium created and what it cost them. They built the most sophisticated urban fire response system in the medieval world. They created Greek fire, the weapon that terrified enemies for centuries. They wrote manuals, trained crews, made fire management a core function of imperial administration. They did everything right, and it still wasn't enough. Because fire in a dense medieval city is fundamentally an unsolvable problem. You can prepare. You can respond quickly. You can create fire breaks and maintain water supplies and organize bucket brigades. But if the wind is wrong, if the timing is wrong, if chaos has already fractured your ability to coordinate, the city burns anyway. That's the lesson Byzantium learned over and over across 1,000 years. Fire is the enemy you can never fully defeat. You can only survive it. Manage it. Hope the wind shifts before everything's gone. Their obsession makes perfect sense now, doesn't it? They weren't being paranoid. They were being realistic. They'd watched fire amplify the Nika riots into apocalypse. They'd watched it save them from Arab fleets. They'd watched it consume districts during the Fourth Crusade. They'd watched it prove again and again that it was the battlefield where strategy meets disaster. So they built systems to fight it, they weaponized it, they tried to master it, and they never stopped fearing it. Because they knew the truth. Fire is the rival power. The force that doesn't care about your walls or your tactics or your 1,000 years of accumulated strategic brilliance. It just burns. Let me tell you what it means to build a civilization around fear. Not the fear of being conquered. Every empire fears that. Not the fear of losing a battle or a province or even a war. Those are normal fears, strategic fears, the kind you can plan around. I'm talking about the fear of something you can't plan around, can't predict, can't control once it starts. The Byzantines lived with that fear for 1,000 years. And it changed them. Think about what it does to a culture when fire is always there, always waiting, not as distant possibility but as present threat. When every summer brings drought that makes the city more vulnerable. When every winter brings heating fires that could spread. When every military crisis might spark the chaos that lets flame loose. You don't just build firefighting systems. You build fire into your identity. The Byzantines didn't just respect fire, They were obsessed with it. It showed up in their military planning, their urban design, their imperial administration, their religious symbolism. Fire became one of the fundamental elements they organized their world around. Because they'd learned the hard way, ignore fire and it destroys you. Master fire and it saves you. Fear fire appropriately, and maybe, you survive another generation. That's not paranoia. That's wisdom bought in ash. The weapon that haunted them. Here's the dark irony at the heart of this entire story. Greek fire, their greatest weapon, their miracle defense, the thing that saved Constantinople more times than we can count, made their fear worse. Not better. Worse. Think about it. Every time Byzantine sailors deployed Greek fire, they watched ships become floating hells. They watched flames spread across water in ways that violated natural law. They watched enemy crews burn alive, jump into the sea and keep burning, scream for mercy that couldn't come. They watched fire prove it was unstoppable. And then they sailed home to a capital made of wood and stone, packed tight, one spark away from becoming exactly what they'd just inflicted on their enemies. They knew what fire could do. They'd weaponized that knowledge. They'd turned it into a strategic advantage. And every victory made them more aware of their own vulnerability. It's like inventing the atomic bomb and then living in a wooden house. You've got the ultimate weapon and the ultimate terror of what happens if that weapon turns on you. The Byzantines carried that psychological burden for centuries. They were the empire that killed with fire and feared fire and worshipped fire and tried to control fire, all at the same time. That's exhausting. That's the kind of existential tension that marks a civilization. What the Crusaders understood. The Fourth Crusade, those Christian knights who were supposed to be liberating the Holy Land but ended up sacking Constantinople instead, they figured something out. Maybe not intellectually, maybe not as conscious strategy, but they understood it instinctively. You don't beat Constantinople by breaking its walls. You beat it by making it burn. The fires during the 1203-1204 siege weren't accidents. Or rather, they were accidents that the Crusaders learned to encourage, learned to exploit, learned to let spread just enough to create chaos without giving the Byzantines time to respond effectively. Every fire was a psychological weapon. Every blaze forced impossible choices. Every district that burned made the next defense weaker. The Crusaders couldn't match Byzantine tactical brilliance, couldn't match their experience or their knowledge of urban warfare, or their sophisticated defensive systems. But they could throw fire into the equation and watch everything else fall apart. Because fire is the great equalizer. It doesn't care about training or experience or 1,000 years of military tradition. It just spreads. And in spreading, it turns all your advantages into liabilities. Your dense population? That's fuel. Your sophisticated infrastructure? That's kindling. Your organized defense? That's about to fragment into chaos as everyone makes individual survival decisions. Fire turns your strengths against you. The Byzantines knew this. They'd always known this. They'd done this to their enemies for centuries. But knowing it doesn't save you when the wind shifts wrong and the flames find your streets. The final lesson. So what did Byzantium learn across 1,000 years of living with fire? That some threats can't be eliminated, only managed, only survived, only feared with the appropriate level of respect. Steel you can stop, armor blocks it, shields deflect it. Formation and discipline and tactical brilliance can overcome steel every single time if you're good enough. Fire doesn't care if you're good enough. Fire turns discipline into panic, turns formations into scattered refugees, turns your fortress into a trap, turns your defenses into fuel. That's why the Byzantines built those systems. That's why they wrote those manuals. That's why they created Greek fire and guarded the formula like a state secret. That's why they organized firefighting like military operations and maintained water systems like strategic assets. Not because they were paranoid, because they understood. They understood that fire was the rival power, the force that could end them faster than any foreign army, the enemy that was always at the gates, or rather, always inside the gates, waiting for the right moment, the right wind, the right spark. They understood that you can build the greatest city in the world, command the most sophisticated civilization of your age, hold off enemies for a millennium, and one fire on one day with one unlucky wind can erase all of it. That's not weakness, that's reality. The Byzantines just had the courage, or maybe the trauma, to face it directly. They lived in fire's shadow for 1,000 years. They weaponized it, feared it, respected it, tried to master it, and in the end, fire outlasted them. Because fire always does. It doesn't conquer, it doesn't occupy, it doesn't need to, it just burns. Let me bring this home. Let me show you why this story matters beyond one empire, beyond one city, beyond medieval warfare. Because here's what Byzantium teaches us. The things we fear most are usually the things we understand best. The Byzantines weren't afraid of fire because they were ignorant. They were afraid of fire because they were experts. They'd studied it, weaponized it, watched it save them and watched it destroy them. They knew exactly what it could do. And that knowledge didn't make them safer. It made them more afraid. Think about that. Really think about it. Most empires fear their enemies. The Byzantines feared a force of nature they'd turned into technology. They feared their own weapon. They feared the thing that made them powerful. That's not irony, that's tragedy. Steel versus fire, the final reckoning. So let's return to where we started. July 1203, Constantinople burning. But now you understand what that moment really means. A sword fight has rules, has limits, has outcomes you can predict. One side wins, one side loses, and tomorrow you know where you stand. Fire has no rules. It doesn't stop when you surrender, doesn't care if you've already lost the battle, doesn't accept treaties or negotiate terms or show mercy to the defeated. A soldier takes your life. Fire takes everything. Your past, burned, your future, ash, your family's heritage, your city's history, your empire's accumulated wealth, gone in hours. That's why steel is the lesser fear. Steel is local, personal, immediate. You see the sword coming. You can block it or dodge it or accept it. There's agency in that moment, even if you lose. Fire removes agency. You don't fight fire one-on-one. You don't defeat it through skill or courage or tactical brilliance. You run from it. You watch helplessly as it consumes things you can't replace. You make impossible choices about what to save and what to abandon. You become powerless. And powerlessness is more terrifying than death. The Byzantines understood this at a level most civilizations never reach. They understood that the most dangerous threats aren't always the ones that target you specifically. Sometimes the most dangerous threats are the ones that don't discriminate. That don't care about your strength or your walls or your 1,000 years of survival. Fire is the great indifferent destroyer. And indifference is more terrifying than hatred. Why this haunts me. Here's what gets me about this story. What keeps me thinking about it. The Byzantines did everything right. They prepared. They innovated. They created systems that were centuries ahead of their time. They turned their greatest fear into their greatest weapon, and it still wasn't enough. Because some problems can't be solved, only survived, only endured, only feared with the appropriate level of respect that keeps you vigilant but not paralyzed. Byzantium lasted 1,000 years in a world that wanted it dead. That's not failure, that's a miracle. And part of that miracle was their relationship with fire. Their refusal to pretend it wasn't a threat. Their willingness to organize their entire civilization around managing something inherently unmanageable. They knew fire could end them. So they built their culture around not letting it. That's not weakness. That's the most profound kind of strength. The strength to live with fear and not let it destroy you, while also not pretending the fear isn't real. The empire that fire couldn't erase, Constantinople, fell in 1453, to cannons, ultimately, to technology that made those legendary walls obsolete, to an Ottoman sultan who understood siege warfare better than anyone alive. But here's what's beautiful. Constantinople survived for 1,123 years, through countless sieges, through the Fourth Crusade's betrayal, through fires and plagues and civil wars and every disaster you can imagine. Fire tried to erase it dozens of times, hundreds of times, and Byzantium just kept rebuilding, kept adapting, kept surviving. That's the real lesson. Not that fire is unbeatable, but that civilizations can live with unbeatable threats and still endure, still create beauty, still matter. The Byzantines built Hagia Sophia in a city that could burn any summer. They created art and literature and law in a capital that was always one spark away from catastrophe. They turned fear into vigilance, and vigilance into survival, and survival into one of history's longest-lasting empires. Fire didn't erase them. It shaped them, made them careful, made them brilliant, made them into the empire that understood better than anyone. Some enemies never leave. You just learn to live with them. The final truth. So here we are, back to July 1203, back to smoke over the Golden Horn and flames jumping rooftops and people running from something they can't fight. But now you see it differently, don't you? Now you see 1,000 years of fear and preparation and hard-won wisdom. You see an empire that turned its nightmare into a weapon, and its weapon back into a nightmare. You see the tragic brilliance of a civilization that understood what most empires never grasp. The things that can destroy you aren't always foreign, aren't always evil, aren't always conscious. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is just fire, wind, chance, the physics of flame in a wooden city on a dry summer day. Steel takes lives. That's brutal. That's tragic. But it's comprehensible. Fire takes everything. Takes your past and your future. Takes your choices and your agency. Takes the city your ancestors built and the future your children would have inherited. That's why the Byzantines feared fire more than steel. Not because they were cowards. Because they were realists. Because they'd watched fire prove again and again and again that it was the rival power, the force that could end empires, break cities, turn strength into ash. And against that force, all their brilliance, all their systems, all their Greek fire and defensive genius, sometimes it was enough. Sometimes they survived another generation. And sometimes the wind shifted wrong, and even Byzantium burned. That's not a failure of preparation. That's just fire being fire. Indifferent, unstoppable, eternal, the enemy that doesn't stop when the fighting stops.